Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third second century lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Peter Singer. I'm John Carroll, a professor in the History Department and also Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts. And I'd like to start by thanking all of the people and organizations who have helped make this possible. First and foremost, of course, our gratitude to Professor Peter Singer for making the long trip here. We are absolutely delighted that you're here. Our thanks also to Professor John Burns and the Faculty of Social Sciences, the Hong Kong International Literary Festival, Swindon Book Company for their generous support. Before I turn things over to our dean, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your mobile phone. This is a chance to make history. This would be the second century lecture not to have a mobile phone go off. We tried this in the first second century lecture, which was in 2013 by Professor Jonathan Spence from Yale University, and we almost made it. 5 minutes to the end. But we succeeded last year, 2014, with Professor Germaine Greer. So let's try to make sure we do it again. With that, it's now my pleasure to invite Professor Douglas Kerr, our dean, to introduce Professor Singer.
I'm not terrified about my phone. I think it's all right. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the third annual second century lecture at the University of Hong Kong. It's great to see you all here. And it is a great honor for us to welcome Professor Peter Singer to speak to us this evening. As you know, academics have only quite recently got used to having their research judged in regular research assessment exercises. Now, however, we face the extra worrying prospect of having our work assessed not only for its quality, but also for its impact. By any measure, Peter Singer's impact score must be stellar. Perhaps even more than his distinguished predecessors as second century lecturers, Jonathan Spence and Germaine Greer, and probably more than any other living philosopher, he's one of those rare scholars whose work really can be said to have made a palpable difference to the world. And in particular, his book, Animal Liberation, which was first published in 1975 and frequently revised, has helped to change the way that people think and feel about the other animals who share our world. And I'm very pleased that he's chosen to talk to us today on the topic Ethics in Animals 40 years after Animal Liberation. Peter Singer is the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University, and he's a laureate professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. Among his many academic and civic honors, in 2012 he was made a Companion of the Order of Australia. His most recent book, titled The Most Good You Can Do, How Effective Altruism is Changing Ideas About Living Ethically, is published by Yale University Press this very month and is available in the foyer, just in time. And incidentally, tomorrow evening, Peter Singer will be talking about that book to the Hong Kong International Literary Festival in town. Singer is both eloquent and trenchant. Ethics is a subject no doubt difficult to write about and certainly challenging to read. A book like Animal Liberation is pretty troubling for any reader, but particularly if you are a meat eater, as I am, and even more so if you work in universities, in some of which the most horrifying crimes against animals have been and continue to be committed. After reading Singer's account of some of the things we do to our fellow creatures, it's easy to understand why George Orwell, at the end of his book Animal Farm, imagined that the most degrading thing that could happen to an animal would be to turn into a human being. Peter Singer has not, however, succumbed to a Gulliver-like misanthropy. On the contrary, his work is devoted to the utilitarian project of getting the best out of human beings. Let's hope he can get the best out of us. We welcome him to Hong Kong University to talk to us about ethics and animals 40 years after animal liberation. Professor Peter Singer.
Thank you very much, Professor Kerr, for that introduction. Thank you, Professor Carroll, and other guests, and all of you present. It's great to see such a lot of interest in this topic, and I hope to do it justice. We have a screen coming down. Good. So I am proud of the fact that this book that I wrote 40 years ago is continuing to have an impact, remain in print. And I might mention, Professor Kerr kindly mentioned the new book, The Most Good You Can Do. But this book also, as of this month, is for the first time available as an e-book. So you can find it online, published by Open Road Media. It has it's not fully updated, but it does have a new preface to it. So what I want to do, as this title suggests, is to look at where we've come from in terms of our attitudes to animals, because I think that gives us an idea of how major a change this is set against the past of the way we've treated animals. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are today and just briefly a glimpse of where I hope we are going. So in looking backwards, although I have to say my expertise is in Western thought and Western philosophy, I thought it would be appropriate if I did start with a couple of Buddhist precepts, which generally speaking you would have to say, as you'll see when I get onto Western thought, you would have to say are much more favorable to the idea of considering the interests of animals than Western thought for not just this same historic period, but for at least, I'd say, 1800 years after the date of the Pali Canon. And it's a curious thing in a way, and maybe we'll have some time for questions and discussion. It's a little bit of a curious thing why this background seems to have made very little difference, one could say no difference, in terms of the way animals are actually treated in countries that have Buddhist traditions. But anyway, so this sort of precepts look very strong, as if they should influence a positive attitude to animals. And here's another one. So if we turn, though, then to the Western tradition, we get some things that are very different. And I regard the Western tradition as having two intellectual roots, one in the ancient Hebrew tradition, the Bible as we know it today, and the other in ancient Greece, Greek philosophy. So here's the famous grant of dominion, if you're in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea that God gives us dominion over the animals, which historically, certainly in the Christian era, was interpreted as essentially saying we can do what we like to animals. You'll see that in a moment. It doesn't have to be interpreted that way. Some modern Christian scholars wish to interpret this as saying God gave us stewardship over the animals rather than dominion. Dominion gives the idea of a lord who can rule over his subjects as he wishes. Stewardship gives you the idea that you're answerable to the person to whom you're a steward. If you're a steward of someone's property while they're away, you have to keep it in good condition to return it to them when they come back. So this is open to different interpretations, but as you'll see, the influence, I think, was certainly clearly negative. And if we then switch to the Greek tradition, we have this idea in Aristotle that the world is a hierarchy of the less rational existing to serve the more rational. So you get plants which have a merely vegetative soul existing in order to serve animals which have an animal soul, and the animals themselves existing for the sake of humans who are rational. And so it's fitting, if you like. It's in accordance with the way that the universe is that we should make use of animals. And there's no particular discussion here of how we should make use of them, whether we should respect their interests in any way or not. There are certainly other Greek traditions. The Pythagorean tradition encouraged vegetarianism, though as we don't really have any extant writings from that tradition, we don't really know why. We're just relying on second-hand reports. There's some scholars who think that there was a belief in the transmigration of souls that came from India into Greek philosophy. But the reason I focus on Aristotle is that it was the Aristotelian tradition that most strongly influenced the West in the early years of the rediscovery in the Christian era of ancient Greek philosophy. And we find that particularly in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, who really, who only knew really Aristotle as ancient philosophers. He refers to Aristotle as the philosopher, as if there is only one philosopher, and so everybody knows who you're talking about. And he saw his idea as that of melding Aristotle into Christian teachings. And because it was Aristotle that he had, and because Aristotle had this idea of the universe being a hierarchy in which the less rational serve the more rational, it was easier for him to do so. Here, as you can see, he's actually quoting from, referring to the Dominion verse. But note the interpretation of that verse, which is about as harsh as you could get. He actually says, reads that Dominion verse as saying, it doesn't matter how humans behave to animals. God has given them to us, and it doesn't matter. And if you look at, there's several other places where Aquinas talks about how animals stand, and it's totally consistent with this idea that it doesn't matter how we treat them. So, for example, he says, nothing that you do to animals can be a sin. There are no sins to animals. There are only sins to other humans who have immortal souls and are part of the eternal fellowship. The only reason that something that you do to animals might be wrong would be if, by being cruel to animals, you then develop a cruel habit and become cruel to humans. So there is that argument, but it's a sin not because of the suffering that you've gratuitously inflicted on animals, but because it may lead you to sin against humans. So animals just don't count. Although Aquinas does not deny that they can suffer, their suffering just doesn't matter on this view. And Aquinas, I think, unfortunately for animals, had an enormous influence on the Christian tradition for many centuries. It was the semi-official philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church right up until almost the present time. And although somewhat less influential on the Protestants after the Reformation, continued, I think, to have an influence on Christian thought. And now we leap forward a few centuries right to the end of the 18th century with the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who has a different view for saying that animals don't really matter. Not a religious one in the same sense, but the idea that animals are only a means to our ends because we are self-conscious and they are not. So for Kant, we we are moral agents because we're self-conscious, because we can reflect on our moral choices. And for some reason that really isn't explained by Kant. Kant doesn't even seem to really see the need to explain it. He assumes that if you're not a moral agent, then you're also not a moral patient or a moral subject. That is, of course, you could say only if you can have some degree of self-awareness can you be judged to do something wrong in a moral sense. But there's no relationship necessarily between that and whether what is done to you can be wrong in itself. And I think that, I don't quite know why Kant thought this. I think it's a mistake. And I'm pleased to say that at least one of America's leading contemporary Kantian philosophers, Professor Christine Korsgaard, who's a professor at Harvard, although generally speaking she's a defender of Kant's philosophy, thinks that this particular claim is simply a mistake, that Kant should have been able to distinguish between the idea of what is required to be a moral agent and what is required to be a moral patient. And Korsgaard herself thinks that Kantians ought to treat animals as ends in themselves, essentially because their suffering, their well-being matters. Okay, so, but around the time that Kant was writing, at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, we do, I think, pretty much for the first time in the Western tradition, get an expression of thought that in some respects goes back to those early Buddhist precepts a couple of thousand years before. This is Jeremy Bentham, of course, the founding father of the English utilitarian tradition. And although this passage occurs only in a footnote, and one might think it's a pity that Bentham didn't give it more prominence, it does make the point very clearly. He actually, the full passage here is one in which he refers to the French revolutionaries. This is written just after the French Revolution had broken out and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Bentham says, the French have realized that the blackness of a man's skin is no reason to condemn him to the caprice of a tormentor. In other words, the French had just liberated the slaves in the French colonies. And he said, perhaps one day we will come to see that, and then he names a few anatomical features that distinguish non-human animals from humans, that these features too are also no reason to abandon a sensitive creature to a tormentor. So he's actually making this parallel between racism and sex and the treatment of animals, the treatment of African slaves and the treatment of animals, which is something that I went on to develop in Animal Liberation. And then he considers the objection, a sort of Kantian objection maybe, saying, yeah, but they can't reason, or they're not self-conscious, or something like that, or they can't use language. And Bentham is basically saying, well, why is that to the point? Surely what the point is can they suffer? And if they can suffer, then that's what matters. It doesn't matter, suffering is suffering, whether the being is capable of reasoning or talking or not. And he goes on to say, if this were not so, then the same would be true of human infants, for example, because they can't reason or talk, but we certainly think that their suffering matters. And then we get the Darwinian revolution in our thought, which I think does help, although it's not explicitly addressed to the philosophical question of animal suffering, it does help to break down the gulf between humans and animals. After Darwin, we can't really think that the universe was a hierarchy in which the less rational were intended to serve the more rational. We know that this was just a long, slow process of evolution that led to the evolution of more rational beings, and in fact, we are not a special part of creation. We have descended from animals. So this is only in Darwin's notebooks at the time. If you look at the date, he didn't publish that until, well, really not even in The Origin of Species. It was really published only in The Descent of Man in 1873, so it took a long time still for Darwin to be ready to make this public, but I think that started to have an effect on attitudes to animals, along with, of course, the growth of Bentham's utilitarian school in England. And eventually that spread and did begin to change those conceptions of animals which we had had for so many centuries in the Western tradition. This is from The Descent of Man, 1871 was. So he actually then also makes the point, as part of his case for evolution, that not only are we similar anatomically, but we also have somewhat similar capacities. That, for example, the pleasure and pain, happiness and misery that we can experience is something that non-human animals can experience as well. So denying the view, I didn't bother to mention the Descartes' view that animals can't suffer, but clearly saying, look, there is evidence of animal suffering as well, in some ways quite similar to ours, or quite similar to that of our children anyway. Okay, that was very brief, but obviously for reasons of time, I need to move on. So let's ask the question, well, where are we now after this Darwinian change in our thought, after the development of the utilitarian tradition? What is the mainstream view? Again, I'm focused, I guess, particularly on the modern view, which is very much influenced by that Western tradition. So this is how I would characterize the mainstream view today. In contrast to Aquinas or Kant, it doesn't deny that animal interests matter. It doesn't deny that it's good to be kind to them, that it's bad to be cruel to them, but it still gives them an inferior status. It still says we do not have to give the same weight to their interests. So gratuitous cruelty we might think of as wrong, depending a bit on the culture, but we might think of bullfighting or dog fights or cockfights or something like that as wrong because it's gratuitous cruelty. If we see somebody picking up a stick and hitting a dog or a horse, we might object to that. But where we're doing something with animals that seems to be directed to some purpose of our own, then we don't really look at the cruelty involved. Whoops, sorry. Wait a minute. So this is the view that I want to argue for to replace that view. I want to argue for a principle of equal consideration of interests, which is not a principle that I invented. It's a principle that you can find in debates about the basis of human equality. Those debates that say, well, we often say all humans are equal. What exactly do we mean by that? What is a sort of underlying principle that justifies us in saying that all humans are equal, even though obviously humans differ in all kinds of capacities and characteristics that you can think of, but we still say in some sense they're equal, and the principle of equal consideration of interests was advanced as a way of understanding that idea of equality. Basically, we're saying, look, the fact that you're white or black or male or female or tall or short or have an IQ that's above 100 or below 100, these are not reasons for giving the interests of one human being more weight than the interests of another. If it's bad to inflict pain for a particular reason on somebody who's white or male or has an IQ of 120, then it's also bad to inflict the same amount of pain on someone who is African descent or female or has an IQ of 80. If they're suffering as much, it's the same amount of pain is just as bad, whoever it is. And that does seem like a sound basis for human equality. But what a lot of the people who advance that seem to fail to see even right up to the 1970s when I started researching and thinking about animal liberation, what they failed to see is that that principle has an obvious application to non-humans as well. There's no reason to say the boundary of that principle is the boundary of our species. If we say, look, even though I'm of European descent and someone else is of African descent, that doesn't give me a right to capture that person, enslave him, make him work for me because I'm ignoring his interests in having a good life, an enjoyable life, not suffering unnecessarily. Then if we say, so you can't draw the bounds of your moral concern around your own race, or your own sex for that matter, then why should we draw it around the bounds of our species? Remember, this is what I'm talking about is just saying it's because you're not a member of my species that I think your interests count less. And that is, in fact, I think what we do when we defend that mainstream view I showed you. Because we don't limit it to people who are of some degree of rationality, for example. We want to include not only the infants that Bentham mentioned, but we also want to include people who are profoundly intellectually disabled. We don't want to ignore their interests and lump them in with animals in the way that we treat them. So we are making this distinction on the basis of species, and this is what I think is not really defensible. You can't really justify saying pain matters less when it's not a human. Or if you do want to say that, then what are you going to reply to the person who says, well, I'm white and so pain matters less when it's the pain of an African. I think you can't defend that position. So this is the view that I want to hold. But note the formulation. It's not saying that there is simple equality in every respect. It's rather saying equal weight to similar interests, irrespective of species. And similar here is an important term because different species will have different interests and might, therefore, those interests might get different weight in certain circumstances. Let me say a little bit more about this. This is what I've just been saying. I use this term speciesism to make the parallel with racism and sexism. They're similarly giving special moral status to an entire group, irrespective of the characteristics of particular individuals. And I think neither race, sex, nor species is relevant to moral status. Now, of course, it's important for this argument that animals are conscious, as Bentham thought. If they were not, then they wouldn't have similar interests to compare. They wouldn't have any interest at all. But I think it's clear that they are. I don't think many people really deny this nowadays. So what's the evidence? Well, the anatomical and physiological similarities, the fact that they behave in similar ways. So if you tread on the puppy's tail when the puppy is resting there, the puppy will respond in quite a similar way to if you tread on a child's hand while the child is resting there. They'll jump and cry out and maybe nurse the part that you've trodden on and so on. And of course, we know from Darwin that we've evolved in the same way, so it would be strange if we behaved in the same way, have similar anatomy and physiology, but there's not something similar going on mentally. But this may not apply to all non-human animals. So when I'm talking about animals, generally in what follows, I'm going to be focused on vertebrates. I think that it's clear that at least all vertebrates have nervous systems that are sufficiently similar to ours. In other words, if we go back to this, the anatomical and physiological similarities are quite close with vertebrates. They become less close with the invertebrates. So I think you would have to admit more doubt in terms of the capacity for pain here. But still, it does seem clear that at least some invertebrates can experience pain, even though they've evolved down a completely different path not completely, I guess there's a common origin, but for many, many millions of years, they've evolved down a different path. And yet, if you look at the behavior of the octopus and the ability of the octopus to learn and to solve novel problems, go to YouTube if you want to look at this, some fun videos of octopus solving interesting problems. It's hard to believe that they're not consciously trying to work something out there. As you go further down this list, I think it becomes more doubtful. And at this point, with the simple bivalves like clams and oysters and mussels, I think it's probably unlikely that they can feel pain. After all, it wouldn't serve the same evolutionary purpose for them since they can't move away from the source of pain. But with insects and with crustacea, it's harder to know what's going on. Insects, for example, the behavior tends to be more automatic, more robotic, you could say. You could more easily imagine programming robots to behave like insects than would be harder to program them to behave like vertebrates with their more sophisticated kinds of choices. But, you know, no doubt one day we'll do that too. But anyway, so I think it's more dubious with insects and so on. And I think the rule would be, well, give them the benefit of the doubt if you can, but not necessarily in all circumstances. Okay, now let me get back to this idea of equal consideration of interests and what it actually amounts to. So I show my students at Princeton this slide because it's taken quite close to Princeton at an organic farm just down the road from Princeton. And I point out to them that these cows with their calves here, at least at this particular time, have their interests satisfied. So they've got what they want to eat, they've got water to drink, there aren't really any predators anymore that would threaten them anyway. They have shelter from hot sun if they want to go into the shade. They will have shelter in winter if the weather gets cold as well. So their interests are fully met. But of course, I then say to my students, if you were confined to an area around New Jersey, even if you were just confined to the campus at Princeton, attractive as it is in many respects, you would not find your interests completely satisfied. There are other things that you want to do. You want to get the train up to New York City maybe and go to a concert or do some travel or many other things. You want to, you have various relatives who don't live near you that you might want to visit, none of which applies. So obviously we ought to treat non-human animals differently from the way we want to treat humans. But it's rather a question of saying where their interests are similar, then we should give similar weight to them. And that's, I think, fairly obvious. But this raises the question of killing, which is more difficult. So what I've said up to now, I think really basically ought to be just accepted by anyone who thinks through. As I said, I've made these arguments for the last 40 years. I haven't seen any really persuasive refutation of them. So I think this should be regarded as, up to this point, as something that we just should accept as having a stronger philosophical basis than any options that would try to justify the way we treat animals. But now I'm getting into what I call some open questions, which I think are more difficult and reasonably diverse views. So this is a question about the painless killing of animals. Is that wrong if it is done painlessly and if they will be replaced by other animals living good lives? So that might be the situation back on this farm here, right? Because these animals are able to enjoy their lives here. Now these calves, they're being raised for beef. These calves are going to be killed when they get to about 18 months of age. But the producer would say, well, if I didn't kill them, I wouldn't be able to have cows and calves on my farm because I need to get some income from that. So I'm going to replace them in that sense by having more calves that I'm going to rear. And that is an argument that I think isn't so obviously wrong. It requires us to go into more serious ethical thought. Let's move on again. So here's an argument from a British philosopher called Roger Scruton for what he calls conscientious carnivorism, although really it's conscientious omnivorism. I think it's not really arguing that you shouldn't eat vegetables. What he's saying here is that, okay, what he's saying, I think, is not speciesism. It's a claim that there is an important extra interest that normal humans have in not being killed. And this extra interest is something to do with our ability to look forward, to project ourselves forward through our lives, and to have things that we want to do, not just like eat this piece of grass now, but things that we want to achieve in the distant future. And this is what Scruton is saying. So cutting short before your time for a human is a tragedy. So because it's a tragedy because you might have wanted to achieve things. Those of you who are students here want to graduate, want to get out in the world, want to have the jobs that your degree will qualify you for. Maybe you want to marry, have children, all of these sorts of things you're looking forward to. I assume that cows don't look forward to, well, certainly they don't look forward to graduating, but I assume they don't even look forward to having children, which is something they can do. I mean, I assume that they simply get pregnant and then they go through the process and they have children, and when they have children, they're certainly very closely bonded to their children. And once they have a calf there, they don't want to be separated from the calf. And that's clear, and that's something that any dairy farmer will tell you, because dairy farmers do take their calves away so that we can drink their milk. But so there's a bond, but it's not as if they're looking forward to this or looking forward to watching their children grow up or anything of that sort. So there are different interests, and arguably, therefore, this provides a reason why it's worse to kill a human who has these capacities than it is to kill a cow that doesn't. There is, however, one catch to this. If you're thinking, okay, great, so now I've got a reason why it's okay to kill animals, at least if they're well looked after during their lives, and that's something you'll see that doesn't happen to most animals. But the catch is that if you're to hold this in a non-speciesist way, then it does change our views about the sanctity of human life for humans who, like cows, are not capable of thinking about their distant future. And that's, say, humans with brain damage that makes them profoundly intellectually disabled. Humans, let's say, who are born with brain damage, who've never had that capacity to look at their future in that way. So the catch here is, if you want to take this argument as a justification for killing animals, it's very hard to see why it's not a justification for killing humans at the same intellectual level, at least where they don't have the potential to develop any further. Okay, let's move on. A second open question is weighing, comparing different experiences of different animals. So this is, I think, a genuine difficulty in terms of thinking where to put our resources. If you've agreed with me so far and you think that we ought to try to reduce the suffering of animals, then should we simply focus on where the largest numbers of animals are suffering, which, as I'll show you in a moment, I think would definitely mean chickens at the moment, or should we say that, say, pigs can suffer more than chickens because they've got larger brains and can do more things? I think that's a genuinely difficult question to make those sorts of comparisons, or chimpanzees even further, but the numbers are very much smaller still. So that's an interesting question, an open question, I think, that is also worth thinking about, and how can we actually understand this? How do we grasp these dimensions of the kinds of suffering that animals are capable And the third one, which I think is a little bit sort of maybe hypothetical for most of us at the moment, is some people think that there's a lot of suffering in nature when predators kill other animals, and some people say, well, shouldn't we do something about that? Shouldn't we try and police nature and reduce the suffering of it? And if so, how would we do that? And then, of course, you'd have to say, well, you know, isn't there, you could remove the predators maybe, then of course you would get the prey animals multiplying, then you could try to manage their fertility with contraception or something like that. But, you know, aren't we then just interfering in nature, and isn't there value in nature as well, independently of this nature of suffering? So I think that this is sort of, you know, at least for the moment, I don't worry about it, whatever you might think the theory of it is. There's so much suffering in the animals that we control and raise that I think it's not something that we really need to think about at the moment. Okay, but let's then look at the suffering that we are causing to animals. What are we doing to animals in the way we treat them? And again, I'm going to have to go quite quickly because I do want to allow you some time for questions, and so I'm going to go through this. So where should we focus? I think the answer is very clear. If we're concerned about the suffering that humans inflict on animals, we ought to be focusing on the animals we use for food. Although, as Professor Kerr said in introducing me, there are horrible things that happen to animals in experimentation and that happen at universities and so on, and I certainly think that people should speak up about that if you see things happening, if you're working in a department that uses animals in research. But the numbers are simply dwarfed by the numbers of animals that we use for food. So we're talking here about leaving out the fish, just talking about land animals. We're talking about 600 times as many animals used by humans for food, raised for food, as are used in all of the research and experimentation we do on animals. And pretty much anything else you think about, you know, if you think about the suffering of pets, of dogs and cats, it's smaller still. So the multiple will be even larger than 600 here probably. So, so I think we should focus our attention on the way animals are reared for food. And the problem is that very, very few of them as a percentage are reared like those cows that I showed you in the earlier slide. This is, let's look at some of this. You may have seen some of this footage before. There's actually video footage online which is more graphic than this. This is the standard way of keeping the breeding sows that produce pork. So these are not the animals that are actually turned into the ham and bacon. These are the mothers of those animals. As you can see, this sow is in a stall that is too narrow for her to turn around and doesn't really allow her to walk more than a single step. Also, in this case, she's on bare concrete. She has no straw. And I'll give you another example, somewhat more modern production. This is another view which shows again clearly how crowded, how narrow these stalls are. This one, there are metal slats. The reason for either the concrete or the slats is labor saving. You can get rid of the feces by hosing them down. If you gave them straw, you would have to go in and change the straw every now and again, and that takes labor, so you don't do it. Basically, these production systems are all geared towards producing the end product as cheaply as possible. There's either no regulation or no effective regulations in most of these industries that stop that. The exception to that would be the European Union, which has banned these individual stalls for sows, and so it's replaced them with group housing, which does allow the sows to move around. So that's the pigs. As I say, I won't worry about that. We talk about eggs. This is, again, extreme crowding of laying hens in cages that where simply all they do is basically exist and lay eggs. And I'll show you another example here. They're so crowded, they're constantly rubbing against the wire of the cages or against each other. And they're in these cages for about a year generally, a year to 18 months. And their feathers will very often get rubbed off from rubbing against each other. They also would attack each other and probably would kill each other because of the crowding and the stress, but their beaks have been cut back with a hot blade in order to stop them killing each other. Just a routine preventive measure that's done to them when they're chicks for the laying hens. No anesthetic is used, and the hen's beak is a very sensitive organ. It's full of nerve tissue, because that's how the hen relates to the environment. Okay, that's also banned in the EU. The cages have to be significantly larger than the standard ones used pretty much everywhere else in the world. Now, if we come to chicken, as I said, chickens, the laying hens are quite a large number, but the chickens that are actually used for meat are a significantly larger number still. And this is a standard way of producing chickens for meat. You have this huge shed that just recedes into the background there, and it's crammed full of chickens. There's a bit of space around them when they're put into the shed, when they're just newly hatched. This shows what they're like after about 6 weeks, or close to 6 weeks, which is the time at which they're slaughtered. They're bred to grow extremely rapidly. So in 6 weeks, they're ready for slaughter. These things down here produce food and water, but they're incredibly crowded. They're undoubtedly stressed because hens are evolved to live in a flock of up to 90 individuals, and they recognize the other individuals after a bit, so they get out of the way of the more aggressive ones. Here, obviously, there are far too many for them to recognize in that sense. There's a lot of other welfare problems. Again, I won't go into details now, but the first thing you ever notice if you walk into this shed is the ammonia in the air. It will probably, it will hurt your eyes and your throat as soon as you breathe in that air. And you've only been in there a few minutes. The chickens are in there the entire time that they're there. And that's the amount of space that they have. So quarto is slightly smaller than an A4 sheet of paper. So less than a standard sheet of paper per bird is the amount of room that they have in these systems. Okay, I won't talk about fish in detail. Basically, the numbers here are even greater, the numbers of fish that we're killing. And I think fish do feel pain. I think as vertebrates, there's pretty clear evidence that they do. If you question that, here's a book by a scientist, Victoria Braithwaite, that gives the reasons why. There is no humane slaughter for fish. On the other hand, those that were wild caught at least have better lives. They have their natural wild lives, in contrast to the factory farmed animals that you've seen that are suffering throughout their lives, the months or a year or so that they're living. The fish don't, although if they're used in aquaculture, then quite possibly they do. We don't really know enough about fish behavior to see if they're stressed, but it does seem quite likely that when they're confined in aquaculture, they are stressed by the crowding and the inability to move around. Okay, let's look at where we're going. Again, briefly. So I think there's a couple of books, one of mine called The Expanding Circle, and a more recent book by Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, called The Better Angels of Our Nature. Are we making moral progress? I think the answer is, on the whole, we are. Whether we're talking about the cruelty we inflict on humans, which I think, if you look at it over the long term, we have reduced a lot of things that were quite horrific that happened in previous centuries. And even though people will always say, well, what about the Holocaust, or what about Stalin's Gulag, or something of that sort. In fact, Steven Pinker calculates that for any human born, even in the 20th century when all those terrible things happened, the chances of meeting a violent death at the hands of other humans were less than in any previous century of human existence. So yes, there were those horrible mass killings, but nevertheless there was less violent killing on the whole, partly simply because there was better law and order than there had been previously. And I think that arguably is extending to animals. That's the argument I make in the expanding circle. And here's some evidence. Now this is, in terms of numbers, absolutely tiny numbers we're talking about, but just in the last 40 years or so, the number of motion pictures in which animals were harmed has dropped quite significantly, suggesting that the public no longer tolerates cruelty to animals for the making of movies, doesn't see that as a sufficient purpose, and the movie producers are following along with that. Perhaps more significantly, vegetarianism is increasing in many countries. I've only here got figures for the UK and for the United States, but you could have figures for Australia, for most of Europe, Canada, and you would see somewhat similar trends. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Some of them would be because of the reasons I've been talking about. Some of them would be for their health. Some of them would be environmental reasons. In the United States, which was always the great meat-eating country, and where there was a steady rise of meat consumption pretty much through the entire 20th century, now we're starting to see, just in the last few years, that actual total meat consumption is declining. What happened for a long time, of course, is that beef peaked around here and then started to decline, probably mostly for health reasons, in the 70s. But chicken consumption just kept going up, so total meat consumption was actually increasing. But around 2009, it actually topped out, and you could extend this. There's another year of figures now available. It's similar. So it looks like Americans have decided to eat less meat, slightly less meat. And I think that's a hopeful sign. A lot of people are doing things like having one meatless day per week for a variety of these reasons. So that's positive. What is not so positive, unfortunately, is closer to home. And although this, this curve looks bad, and I think it is actually very bad in many reasons, it's fair to say that the average level of meat consumption in China is still much lower than the United States. So there's hope that this curve will also top out, and hopefully it will top out long before it gets to the point that the United States is at now. But it is obviously causing a continuing increase in the number of animals that are being reared for food, and overwhelmingly these are in the kinds of factory farms that you saw before. So, this is where, in a way, things have to change. And will they change? Well, they need to change partly because of the amount of grain that is being consumed to feed these animals. Obviously, all these animals that we bring inside, we have to feed. So we're feeding them huge amounts of grain, soybeans, and fish meal, and it's a very wasteful process. We're wasting tons of food in the process. Far from actually feeding more people, we're making it more difficult to feed the growing population of the world by wasting so much grain and soybeans in the process of rearing animals. And it's also contributing to climate change. The Food and Agriculture Organization has said that the livestock sector generates more carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent than the entire transport sector, than all cars, planes, trains, ships, trucks, and the rest of it. So we really have to do something about this. Obviously, we have to do something about all of the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, stationary power, transport, but we can't ignore livestock. Livestock is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and that's another powerful reason for reducing consumption of animal products. And here's another reason that you'll be very familiar with locally as well, particularly the factory farmed condition is like an ideal environment for creating viruses and spreading them. And I have no doubt that unless things change, we're going to find more viruses that originate in the livestock industry. Okay, with fish, there's a big issue of sustainability with wild-caught fish, even apart from the lack of the humane killing. And with aquaculture, as well as that, we have a similar problem because if we're using carnivorous species of fish, if we're farming salmon, for example, we have to catch other fish to grind up and feed to them. So we're still putting pressure on the oceans, even if we are farming the fish. It doesn't mean that we're not having harmful impact. And one fish stock after another is being depleted to the point where they are no longer commercially viable. So is there hope for the future? Well, one source of hope, I think, is our ingenuity in creating products that will satisfy people's desire to eat animal products without actually involving animals. This is a startup that was started up just a few years ago in the United States, essentially by people who were concerned about animal consumption, both for animal regarding reasons and for environmental reasons. And it's now producing things like mayonnaise, which is not made from eggs, not made from any animal products, and as you see, other kinds of toppings, creams and things. It's essentially, it's trying to replace the industrial use of eggs in particular. So not whole eggs in shell, it's hard to imagine how you could make them from plants, but all of the powdered egg, which is about 30% of egg production, could be replaced in a way that is healthier, more environmentally sustainable, less likely to carry salmonella, and of course, cruelty-free. So that's what they're aiming at, and they're already their mayonnaise is in supermarkets in the United States, and they're developing a number of other products as well. So that's one way of doing it. And here's an alternatives to meat. You can look at this website, newharvest.org. It has a lot of information on it. It's producing, there's a variety of possible plant-based alternatives to meat, and there is also the possibility of growing meat at the cellular level. You might have seen a couple of years ago there was a big tasting of the first hamburger to be produced just from a single cell which had then been cultivated in vitro. That particular hamburger was, the newspaper said, cost $300,000 to produce. But the good news is we're now down to, I think, about $12. Still a little on the pricey side for a hamburger. But, if we scale this up, it's possible that we will be able to do that. And if not, there's going to be other plant-based alternatives, I think, to a lot of this. So that's one reason for hope that we can reduce our consumption of animals. But I think it's going to take a lot of different arguments, ethical arguments for the animals, for the environment, and no doubt health concerns as well, in order to reduce the amount of suffering that we currently are unfortunately inflicting on animals. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And we have some time for questions, not very much. Please keep your questions short. Do ask a question, don't make a speech. I see a hand right up in the back corner there. Yes, you in the blue shirt in the back there, yeah.
Excuse me, I would like to ask, what is the distinctions between animals and humans in your philosophy? Or that's not the questions you would like to concern?
A distinction between humans and animals? Yes. Look, various people have always tried to say, well, the key thing is, whatever it is, and people talk about abilities to think and use tools, and then they found animals that use tools, and then they said to make tools, and then they found animals that will make tools as well. I think that the distinction is just a distinction of species. We have a particular set of chromosomes, and that's what distinguishes humans from animals. I don't think there's much point in looking for some sort of essence of what is distinctive about humans, because if you do, then usually then people would talk about higher cognitive abilities. But obviously there are some humans that don't have higher cognitive abilities. As I said, they're still humans. It doesn't mean that they're not members of our species, that they're not human beings. But what it shows is that there is an overlap, essentially, that on any of those scales, you'll find maybe most humans' cognitive abilities are greatly superior to those of animals, but there's an overlap. There are many humans who can't solve problems that chimpanzees can solve, for example. Okay, any other? Yes, in the back up there. Yes, that's right there.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I was just wondering, what is your opinion on things like so-called happy eggs or organic farms or free-range farms? Is it, is there any point to having a farm where chickens can frolic around happily if they're going to be killed anyway? Should we just stop killing chickens or cows or whatever the animal is? Should we just stop it point blank, or is there any worth to having a kind of more healthy, friendly animal environment?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I do think if we could stop at point blank, that would be the best thing to do, because I think even with those places where animals have a much better life, I think there's still likely to be abuses, and I think there's still an attitude of animals being things for us to use that is likely to always make it difficult to see that they're properly treated. But the reality is that, at least for the foreseeable future, people are still going to want to eat eggs. As I say, even though there's ways of replacing the industrial uses of eggs, people are still going to want to eat whole eggs. Probably people are still going to want to eat meat, at least until we develop really good alternatives. And so for that reason, I think there is a point in having those alternatives, because the animals undoubtedly have better lives. They suffer less. So I don't think we can wait for a complete change. I think I'd like to reduce the suffering of animals right now. And if people would firstly reduce their consumption of animal products, and secondly, avoid the factory farm products where the greatest amount of suffering is inflicted, I think that would be a step in the right direction. Yes, okay, down the front here. Do you wait for a microphone, please?
Professor Singer, just now you mentioned about that the number of people, people in China have been eating more and more meat. And also, most of us have seen pictures and videos which show pigs and dogs and cats and even elephants or whatever, or even horses being skinned alive in open markets in China. And
Please come to the question. Okay. I did ask you not to make a speech.
The question is that what kind of strategy people all over the world may adopt in order to protest against this inhumane actions against animals in China?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question. You said people all over the world, so I think people do express their revulsion when they see these videos of quite horrible treatment of animals in China, which certainly would not be permitted in United States or Europe or Australia or many of those other countries. But if you say, what difference does that make? My sense is that if it is only people from outside China who are objecting to that, it's not really going to change. The movement for change has to be inside China as well, and it will take people like you here and others in mainland China, to really say this is unacceptable. And I did visit mainland China a couple of years ago, and I spoke at a few universities there. And I was quite impressed by the fact that, rooms like this size, were filled with students who seemed to also be supportive of the idea of animal rights, or at least of better treatment of animals. And I found that encouraging. Of course, I know it's a huge country, and I spoke maybe in total to a couple of thousand people, so it doesn't tell you very much really. But I think that there is going to have to be that change, and perhaps it's going to have to be a generational change of people really developing different attitudes. And I know there's been most of the animal activity in China has been about dogs and cats and so on, pets. I hope that it spreads to include the animals used for food as well. Yes, you're in the middle there with the red scarf. Yes.
Thank you. At the beginning, you mentioned briefly about Buddhism and Christianity, and it seems that Christianity is, allow me to say that, bad guy for animals. So how you think the current situation or status of Christianity, and also how about Islam? Because these three seems to be the major or biggest religions in the world.
Right, yeah. I mean, so you said, certainly it's consistent with what I showed, that Christianity seemed to have a worse attitude to animals for most of its history. And yet the strange thing is that the countries that have a Christian tradition now treat animals rather better than China does, as was just said. So I don't really know what is going on there. I'm sure there are people who are much more knowledgeable about Chinese culture and its attitudes to animals in the room than I am. As for Islam, Islam it's a little bit like Judaism, I guess, in that there are different things you can interpret. In Judaism, there's that dominion verse that I showed you, but there are also some lines in the Jewish holy books that do refer to kindness to animals. And in Islam too, I mean, they're not actually direct commands or injunctions in the Quran, but they're things like the story that the Prophet put down his cloak and a cat went to sleep on it. And when he wanted to pick up his cloak, rather than disturb the sleeping cat, he cut off the corner of the cloak so that the cat could continue to sleep. So that certainly suggests that we ought to give some weight, even quite a lot of weight really, to the interests of animals. So there are some imams and Islamic thought leaders who do think that kindness to animals is part of injunctions in Islam. Okay, shall we go over this side? Yes, on the edge of the road there.
Thank you, Professor, for bringing up information and also your observation and perhaps some conclusion. I'm not sure if it's fair to raise two questions, but I promise they will be short. So the first one is that there is less suffering of animals shown on the screen or TV. But I thought about in Hong Kong, probably starting from the 70s, we've been seeing programs with throwing cakes onto people's face. But this thing has very little to do with the food waste in Hong Kong as a big picture. So do you think we are lacking the knowledge of how we are treating animals badly, or would you think that more noises would only make people shut their ears? So I'm sorry, perhaps I should stop here because I'm not very
Okay,
clear.
well, thank you. Look, I don't really know how much, let me ask you, so if the slides that I showed you of factory farming were new to you, if you hadn't seen these images or didn't really know how, like this is 99%, I guess, of the food animals were raised, put up your hands. So if this was new to you, put up your hands. I'd like to know how many of you didn't know about this. Well, it seems like you did know about it. That's good, but of course, this is a university-educated audience, I suppose. It doesn't tell me a lot about most people, but so it seems like it's not just knowledge, that it's something else, whether it's apathy or it's not wanting to be different from others. There's a lot of social pressures that often lead to this. There is plenty of information out there, whether it appears on television or not. You can certainly find it online. So I think probably if people want to know about this, they can, and if they don't know about it, it's really because they're deliberately turning away from it. So this does still leave the question of how do you get people to really think about what's going on and decide that they don't want to be part of it. That's the difficulty. Okay, yes, in the middle there. You need a microphone. Down here? Yeah, it's all right. No, sorry, I think it's being recorded, so you do, it's coming here.
Can you please talk about the subsidies in the meat industry? Because it seems that an economic change would make a huge change in terms of the behavior as well.
I really can't. I don't know anything about subsidies in Hong Kong or China. I'm sorry. There are some subsidies that go to farmers in the United States. The main thing actually is the Farm Bill, which subsidizes farm production, including particularly grain production, but that means the price of grain is very cheap, and that's why, even though it's so wasteful to feed grain to animals, that makes it more economic to raise animals in factory farms. And I don't know, perhaps I don't know that China, how much US grain China imports. It imports a lot from other countries. So I think I better pass on that question, really. Okay, we'll have you down the front there.
Professor Singer, I would like to ask one question only. I would like to ask.
Good.
Yeah. I would like to ask, what do you think about the reason for acting morally? Like,
okay,
a disclaimer. Actually, I'm myself a utilitarian, and
right.
Namely, what's the reason for acting according to the utilitarian principle for you?
Yeah, that's at least a whole lecture, if not a whole book. But if you asked it for me, okay, I think I can give you two quick answers. One is, it just seems obvious to me that if we can reduce suffering at not a great cost to ourselves, that's the right thing to do. So there is a sense of, I want to live ethically, and that presupposes, I guess, the idea that I'm thinking that I want to live ethically, and this is a part of living ethically. But if you want to try and get behind that, I also think that I would say that our own lives go better. Now, this is not a sort of necessarily a kind of cycle of karma coming back. It's more for me the idea of finding some satisfaction and fulfillment in knowing that I'm contributing to making the world a better place, even if just in a small way. And I contrast that with the kind of ideal, more materialist ideal of life that I think a lot of advertising promotes, and that is that the better life is one where I can buy more consumer goods. And I think there's actually good evidence from psychological studies, firstly, that buying more consumer goods isn't a sustainable way to happiness, and I mean sustainable even for the individual, because you may get a brief buzz from owning them, but you're really on a kind of treadmill where you have to keep going in order to maintain your level of happiness. You have to buy more, and therefore you have to earn more, and then you buy more, and so on. Whereas psychological research also shows that people who are generous, people who care about others, are more satisfied with their lives. They find more fulfillment in their life. And I've spent a long time now both working with people who work for animals, who are caring about others, and people who are concerned about the global poor. And I do think that generally they're very satisfied with what they're doing, that they feel they've improved their own lives as well as the lives of others. Okay, we'll go over this side of the room now for change. Yes, in the blue shirt there. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Singer. I remember there was this judge case in America just some time ago. There was this animal rights group who challenged the state, one of the states in America, to release chimpanzees because they have rights. The judge said they cannot have rights because they don't have the ability to perform duties. I personally don't like that kind of argument because I don't think that rights are an exchange for performing duties, but it does have a very, it does form an argument for me because when we consider moral systems, we think that individuals who participate in that moral system are able to reciprocate considerations. Since it is almost obvious that animals cannot necessarily reciprocate our consideration, do you think that is a legitimate argument against, or at least an interesting challenge against expanding our consideration towards animals?
Well, I don't think it's a sound argument. You know, maybe it is of some interest. It presupposes a kind of that morality is a sort of social contract. And the problem with that is, you know, you could apply the Bentham quote that I gave you, that again, a baby cannot reciprocate, profoundly intellectually disabled human cannot reciprocate, and the largest case of all is that future generations cannot reciprocate. So on this view, we have no obligations to future generations as such. Climate change, therefore, diminishes as a problem. It's not that it doesn't exist because, you know, if you're younger than I am, climate change is probably going to be a significant problem in your lifetime, and maybe you care about your children, it's going to be a problem for them. But, you know, climate change is a big problem because the effects are going to last, on some estimates, 3,000 years. Now, you know, people even 300 years in the future, we don't know, we don't care about directly, and obviously they can't reciprocate anything we can do for them. So if morality is a social contract, we don't have to care about the fact that in 300 years maybe the planet will be a much worse place to live in. But that just seems obviously wrong, so I don't think this is a sound argument. We'll go over this side now, yes.
Thank you. I want to ask if there's a conflict of interest between humans and animals. For example, if a young dog and an old man are in a situation of danger and you could only save one, then what would be the right thing to do?
So as I said, I mean, you said a situation of danger. If you assume that it's a danger to their life, then, you know, unless the old man is perhaps very old and no longer has any achievements that he wishes to make or anything of that sort, I think you could argue that the interests of the human in continuing to live normally would outweigh those of the dog. If you're just talking about something that will cause them temporary pain or distress, I wouldn't make that choice. I think it would just depend where the pain or distress was going to be greater. Yes, okay, we'll come back to you now.
I was wondering, like, whether the notion of distinguishing animals based on the degree of pain or suffering they feel is in a way type of speciesism, and like the fact that you are categorizing them in a way in a hierarchy. And secondly, like in that case, would a human being who is less capable of feeling that pain would also be morally justified of being killed or suffering, that kind of thing?
Okay, it's not speciesism because it doesn't depend on species. As I said, you know, if you have an animal that has higher cognitive capacities than a human, then, you know, to adapt that question that I was asked, then you ought to save the, you know, you would say that you wouldn't make that necessarily that choice that you want to save the human. So it's not speciesism, but, you know, what you're pointing out is that it is hierarchical in a way, and it's hierarchical on the basis of the kinds of interests it's being had and their cognitive capacities. Now, you know, the question is, if you don't like that for some reason, what are you going to put in its place? I mean, are you going to say, well, any being that is capable of suffering has the same moral status, or would you not even want that? I mean, some people would say, well, that's sentientism or something like that, right? But then, I mean, I do think that there's real differences here that matter morally. I don't think it would make sense to say that we ought to have equal respect for all living things, and that it's as wrong to pick a blade of grass or to cut off a cabbage as it is to kill a human. That seems to be ignoring what are really morally significant differences. So my view is that species like race and sex are not intrinsically morally significant, but differences in various capacities, including the kinds of interests you can have, the capacities to suffer, different ways in which you can suffer, are morally significant and can legitimately be taken into account. I think you're giving me a look there. We have one last question. There was, okay, in the red shirt he will have there, yes, okay. Sorry, it's down here, right down here in the middle. Sorry, I apologize to those of you who had your hands up. There was a lot of people with hands up and we cannot get to them all.
I note you have an article with Agatha Sagan about being open to the possibility that even artificial intelligence, AIs could have interests and so on. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because the article was really short.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, you know, the consciousness that we know is associated with a biological brain, right? A carbon-based life form. And they're the only kinds of consciousness that we know. But in principle, there's no reason why consciousness needs to be embodied in a brain of that type. So it's conceivable that we could replicate whatever it is that produces consciousness, you know, certain complexity of synapses and cells and so on, and that somehow consciousness supervenes on that once you get to a certain level of complexity. So it's conceivable that we could get that in artificial intelligence. I certainly wouldn't rule that out. Interesting question is how you tell that you've actually got consciousness and not that you've got a very clever computer of the kinds that you can already do a bit of dialogue with, where, you know, for a little while it's sometimes hard to tell whether you're interacting with a computer or a human. But, you know, it's not that difficult yet if you ask the right questions, but it easily could get more difficult. And so there's, while I would certainly think it's conceivable that we could have consciousness in artificial intelligence, actually knowing that we've got it might be more difficult. Thank you very much for all your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Singer. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to present you with a souvenir. No animals were harmed in the making of this souvenir, as far as we know. I'd like to invite Miss Becky Huang up to the stage to present the souvenir. Ms. Huang is an undergraduate student here at Hong Kong U and is also the chair of the Hong Kong U Arts Association.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Now, before we end the night's event, we must have a group photo. So I'd like to invite the distinguished guest in the very front to please come up and have a photo taken. This technically is the end of the third second century lecture, and I want to thank you all for coming, but before you leave, I just want to remind you that as soon as we're done with this group photo, Professor Singer will be happy to sign books outside in the foyer. So thank you once again.